thank you all for coming. I know it's spring break week, and I know it's absolutely gorgeous outside, so thank you for coming inside and spend a little bit of time with us today. Don't want to spend a lot of time introing this thing, because John Wilbanks is the real attraction. He's the guy who's going to tell us what we should be thinking about for Google Fiber and what it could mean for the city and for entrepreneurs and for innovation in the next 5, 10 to 15 years, which is the reason we put this together, was to try to bring issues to the fore that we may not be thinking of. You know, let's think about what this really means for our city in the long run, and not just what we can do with it today or even next year or even the year after that, but in the really long term. So he's going to help us see the future, so to speak. But before we jump into John, I just wanted to review, you know, the things that this group always talks about, our goals. You can see them up there. Our last speaker, this is the second of 4 speakers we're going to have, at least in the short run. All Kauffman affiliated folks, 3 of them being Kauffman Senior Fellows. So the initial goals that this group had laid out was to start 25 companies in 2012 that are going to create 100 jobs. Obviously, the timeline shifted a little bit because we don't know a whole lot more about Google Fiber, but these are the goals that we're sticking with. However, our last speaker pretty much blew them out of the water. Just to briefly recap what Scott Case, one of the founders of Priceline.com, talked about was, you guys are thinking way too small. You're off by a huge magnitude. He said you should be thinking about creating 2,500 companies and don't even measure the jobs. Don't worry about the jobs. The jobs will come if you create that number of companies. And I won't hit on all of these, but you can see some of the other things that he mentioned that we should be thinking about. Not necessarily goals, but just things that we should be doing, things we should be thinking about. Obviously, these are in PowerPoint format. We can talk about any more of these if you're interested. Unfortunately, we did not record the last one, but we are recording this one, so we will be able to send it out in video format after this is over. So he's talking about creating the illusion of Google Fiber, that there are buildings in the city right now that have gigabit capabilities. So how can we use that or create the illusion of it in a home without actually having Google Fiber on the ground? So we're actually having some internal conversations about what that might look like, both internally in the Kauffman Foundation and at the mayor's IMBIT level. Startup weekend every weekend. Why not? As Adam about falls out of his chair, but could be interesting. I thought this was really interesting. He said, don't ask college kids what's next. Don't even ask high schoolers. They've already given up on Facebook. Ask your middle schoolers. Middle schoolers? Are you serious? I've seen the way my 2.5-year-old plays with my iPhone and my iPad. It's unbelievable. So just thought it was a very interesting point. Needs leadership. One of the things he talked about was some of the other cities that have had successful entrepreneurship renaissances that have remade themselves in very innovative ways, is that they've had leadership. I just thought that was a very key point. So this is the second in our series. We've already had Scott Case come and talk to us. Today is John Wilbanks. I had a chance to talk to John for 30 to 45 minutes yesterday, and I'm still thinking about the conversation. It was just very cool stuff. I think you're going to be very impressed with what he has to say and how he's going to challenge us. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on his bio, but he's just been very engaged in this sort of, you know, common internet space. He knows a lot about the technology behind this stuff, a lot about the theory behind it, and he has a lot of crazy friends, I think, is another thing I've realized, which in this context is a really good thing to have, I think. So we're going to have 2 other speakers in this series. Nick D'Onofrio and Paul Kodrowski, both are Kauffman Senior Fellows, and they're each going to challenge us in different ways. Sorry, we've had to move the dates on this a little bit. Paul Kodrowski was going to be on March 28th. Now he's April 18th. I believe both of these will be in this room and at the exact same, or from noon to 1:30. Nick D'Onofrio, of course, worked at IBM and has done some amazing things. Paul has so much influence, he literally moves markets and is a technology entrepreneur by trade, but knows a lot about a lot of different things, and he's going to really be able to challenge us. So make sure you have those on your calendar. We'll be sending out regular reminders as we move forward. And so without that, I've given John a little bit of an idea of what we want him to talk to us about today, but I hope he gives us some new goals, and I hope he really gives us a whole lot to think about. So with that, John Wilbanks.
Thanks, Cameron. It doesn't want to come up here. You need to unmute it, I think. Okay. I don't have the same view over here, which is odd. Okay. Sorry, you're not supposed to see my son. So I was trying to think of a way to talk about this, because this is actually a really interesting issue, and it's not one that's sort of self-evident how to talk about something like Google Fiber, because there's never been anything like it. And so I actually thought that, even though I'm not the world's biggest Rumsfeld fan, that there's actually a frame that Rumsfeld came up with. It's a very powerful way for thinking about the world. And he got made fun of it in the popular press at the time, but it's actually something that if you're a philosophy person, like I am, I actually studied semantics a long, long time ago, is a very important way to think about the way things are. And so he talked about the known knowns, the known unknowns, the unknown knowns, and the unknown unknowns. And it's a very, very powerful way to deal with an emergent situation that you don't understand, is to try to categorize things into these 4 categories. And when I talked to Cameron yesterday, this was not the talk I was going to write. I had one written and I scrapped it. Because when I heard about the business plan competition and what had come in, what became clear is that business plan competitions get you, for the most part, the known knowns. Right? In some cases, you get the unknown unknowns, but for the most part, they get you incremental advances on things that already exist, plans that might reasonably be achieved. Right? Plans that might generate revenue in 12 to 18 months, those don't tend to be very disruptive things. And so when I talked to Sam and I talked to Cameron, I was like, well, we can make Netflix faster. Right? That was the consensus of a lot of things. We can make streaming go faster. So this would be of interest to people who make Apple TV. It would be of interest to the people behind Roku, Google TV, and all sorts of other systems, because they have real problems in load balancing, caching, buffering, and so forth. And you need high bandwidth systems that can help you deal with that. But those tend to be incremental advances on existing technologies, and they're not that exciting. They're not going to create a lot of jobs necessarily here, because the bandwidth needed to do that is already 90% of the way there. I live in a building in Oakland. We have 100 megabit down, 100 megabit up. So going to a gigabit is an incremental advance. We cut our cable to use Roku, and 1 out of 10 shows that we watch on Hulu has a buffering problem. Right, so an incremental advance on that's not likely to create 2,500 companies or associated jobs. Right? And these are the channels I can already get on my Roku. And these are just the ones that are official channels. So that train has kind of left the station in the sense of really being disruptive. And you really don't want to be in the hardware business. There's 4 or 5 other people trying to make boxes that you attach to your TV that convert internet into television. And only Roku has gotten a real breakthrough. Even the Apple TV has struggled to break out. So another thing that I heard was, okay, well, we'll be a data storage. We'll have lots of data storage startups. So this is Buzz Data. They went live today. I could have picked 50 other companies. They're all doing variations on word Dropbox for data. For data sets. We had a conversation with some folks from SSRN with E.J. Reedy and other Coffin folks last night. It's the Social Science Research Network. They're saying, well, maybe we should get into storing and serving data sets. And you just have to point out the market is moving so fast already, right, that there's been a massive investment in data companies in Silicon Valley and Boston and New York and in other places. These guys are from Toronto. Basically, if you want to upload a data set, you can upload a data set. You can talk about it. Their business model is if you keep it private, you pay. If you make it public, it's free. And they are suffering massive competition, and they have almost no revenue right now. Because the reality is there's not a huge market for people to upload and use data because we don't have that many people who are data literate. So you can make incremental advances in these known places, but the likelihood is in a place like Kansas City, they're going to be service-based models, right? Not product-based models. And this is something that we actually know pretty well. And so if you want to classify business opportunities in the known knowns, I would wager that they are actually service-based models, right? So professional services, right? If you're living in a world of streaming, right, there's an enormous amount of legal complexity for which there's almost no expertise. And it's fairly easy to import. So you have international content restrictions. If you've ever tried to play a Region 4 DVD and a Region 2 DVD player, extrapolate that problem out to what Netflix and Hulu and Roku are trying to deal with. There's actually a professional services opportunity in the recruitment of lawyers, paralegals. These are really high-value deals. All of the big technology players need to deal with them. There's technical services around data. For the most part, nobody knows how to push giant data sets from one server to another in a very effective way. Now, a lot of the people I know in the life sciences still actually unplug drives and FedEx them because it's faster than using the internet to transfer data. And so technical services that leverage the fact that you've got massive fiber and therefore probably massive computers would be really important. So if you could actually create the cultivation of technical consulting firms who actually know what you can do in terms of physically moving the data bits from one machine to another, providing privacy assurances, providing security assurances, as well as providing certain sort of bandwidth guarantees. And these are not necessarily the jobs that you think of as sexy and exciting when you have Google Fiber, but these are really good jobs. And they're very hard to take someplace that doesn't have gigabit fiber. And they're relatively easy jobs to recruit for because, I mean, I know quite a few lawyers who really would love to work for Spotify or Pandora or RDO. Right? I'm married to one. Right? They're not hiring. They have like one person who works on IP, and all they're trying to do is assert patents against their competitors. So having law firms who say, we are the law firm for dealing with streaming content, and the reason you should work for us is that if not only do we have the expertise, all of our clients are the ones who are on gigabit. You have a competitive advantage as a law firm over a Wilson Sonsini who's going to give you, a $1,000 an hour 26-year-old associate with a Harvard law degree and no experience. Those are good jobs, right? And it could get weird, and I'm going to come back to this later, but if you think about, right, we've had software as a service, we've had, everything else as a service, but if you start to think about bandwidth as a service, there's a lot of ways it can go. This is going to feed into the rest of the boxes of the square. Right? So unknown knowns are something that sort of we started dealing with yesterday with Cameron and when I was talking with Sam and with Lisa. Right? So I tried to take a screenshot of ESPN3, and this is how unsatisfying it is. Right? It's a mixed basketball and soccer image because live streaming is so bad. So Hulu and Roku and Netflix are streaming static content that's already been recorded. But the live streaming of live events is basically painful to watch, right? I mean, I don't have cable, as I said, so watching the Super Bowl required the liberal application of whiskey to deal with the buffering. Right? It's one thing if it's the movie and you're like, okay, the movie's going to come back, but if you're watching a live event and it buffers for 3 minutes and you miss the key play of a game, you go crazy. I love sports. Right? If ESPN made a box that just streamed me ESPN, I'd pay $30 a month for it. If I have Comcast, Comcast pays $7 a month to ESPN. But there are major technical issues involved in the live streaming of events, whether it's sporting events or political events or news events or whatever. And there's ancillary things around that haven't been dealt with either. So this is a major known unknown. Because everyone talks about the fact that the streaming of sports in particular hasn't been cracked, and Americans will pay an enormous amount of money for sports. And you could maybe even debut this in one of the non-Big Four, right? So the Big Four traditionally are called, hockey, baseball, pro football, pro basketball. You've got two of the four here. But you've also got pro soccer, as Lisa pointed out to me yesterday. Soccer is a sport that there are a lot of people from outside this country who live in this country who will pay a lot of money to watch it. Again, I live with a Brazilian. I know this. When my in-laws come, right, we have to turn the cable back on so that we can get Paulista Soccer, which streams 24 hours a day on one channel on Comcast, and for which we pay $25 a month while they're in town. Right? There's a lot of jobs in figuring out how to stream live sporting events. And the things that come around that are really interesting. So if you think about things like the ticker, right, the sports ticker on sports, right, there was a company that cracked that. The crawl, right, the same way. I think it's called Chiron is what they call it, is a Chiron. Imagine being able to mute those things so you could just watch the sports that you wanted to watch. You didn't have to see all the different information coming around, right? Digital makes that very easy to do. Imagine being able to automatically flip during commercials to other games that you'd pre-selected that you cared about. Right? Only having some sort of integrated load balanced system that can deal with that would let you have that sort of control over your content. And that's the sort of thing that you would normally do in a data center, right? But you don't actually have to have a data center if you have an entire city that can form a data center, which is really one of the benefits of having fiber that you're going to have. You don't have to build a plant, right? It's actually your city is the data center. And so this is what I thought when I looked at this thing, is like, I can't make it unugly. I mean, look at it. Right? I've got ads, I've got facts, I've got a completely hazy image, and this is the best of the best. So then you've got things like Google Hangout. Has anybody here ever used Google Hangout? So the idea is you can have up to 10 people in a group video chat. Right? I've been on a couple of them. It's moderately worse for me than a conference call because I can't pretend I'm not paying attention. Right? But it's the only reason anyone uses Google+. And this uses a ton of bandwidth and a ton of processing power, and it's going to get worse because the cameras on the computers are going to get higher resolution. And they're going to want to send higher and higher quality things, and you're going to want to start sharing live video in one of those windows. Right? I only use Google+ so that my son's grandparents in Brazil can see him because it's better than Skype. But those cameras are going to demand more and more bandwidth. And again, Google can keep trying to invest in that by paying for really expensive data centers, right, which require installation near hydroelectric facilities, right? The last I heard, a single Google compute cluster consumes as much power as the city of Manchester, England. Now, part of that is because you put all the computers in the same place, they all radiate heat, and you have to air condition it. If you begin to fragment and federate and decentralize that, your power profile starts to look really different. Right? And then there's this, and this is an iStock photo for the cloud, right? Which is like the cheesiest one I could find, right? Because the cloud is just another word for on the internet. It's a really good job of branding the internet. But it doesn't matter if the cloud stuff lives in Seattle or in Mountain View or anywhere. And so there's another thing, one of the other known unknowns is people are going to want fast access to stuff on the cloud. So in many ways, a service where you provide fast upload of data is going to be tremendously valuable. Because if you think about the way bandwidth is allocated to businesses, you pay a certain amount for download because that's what we assume people want. But your uploads are almost always throttled. It's almost always asymmetric. If you get Comcast, they'll say 30 megabit down, 5 up. And then they really screw you to get the same amount up. And so there's a tremendous opportunity in providing upload to the cloud. And the reason you would want to do that is for things like this. This is an augmented reality app. The idea is that you walk around with your iPad with the camera on, and it's sucking in data from Maps and Yelp. This is not fake. This is real. And you sort of basically point it, and it says, oh, this restaurant that I'm pointing my iPad at is well reviewed. I should eat here, whereas the one on the left has failed 4 sanitation checks. Right? This requires the pulling together of map data, GPS data, review data, right, as well as whatever it is that you're looking at. And ideally, it's going to be synchronous. You're going to be sending data back at the same time. So this requires just a brutal amount of bandwidth. And if you do this right, you can do the load balancing so most of the processing and the heavy bandwidth work is happening in one geographic area. Because I, as a user, this is from Italy, I don't really care where the images and everything are being processed and served together. But it can be far faster if it's all coming from someplace that has a giant screaming pipe up to the internet than if it's pulling from 45 sites, each of which has throttled pipes, which is the current situation. Right? A lot of the time we're complaining about download speeds. It's not a download problem. It's an upload problem because every website pulls from 50 different places. And there's no reason you have to stop that business model if you can get those businesses to actually have their jobs in a place that has gigabit. It's not a long-term advantage, but it might be a short-term advantage. Right? The Google self-driving car, we see these, again, I see these in the Bay Area. They're labeled just to terrify you when you drive past one going like 65 on the interstate. Right? But you can do an enormous amount of things, again, if you have the bandwidth to serve the data back and forth. If you have RFID tags on your light posts, and you have the ability to render that and push it up, you can actually start to have something like this in Kansas City relatively easily. And again, what's nice is the data that you push back up about that to a company like Google increases the odds that Google keeps doing things here, right? People who like big data are drawn to big pipes of big data. And right now, the only place to get at it is New York if you're a quant, right? Or Silicon Valley if you're doing social media stuff, or Amazon. But you can really draw in the big data people and the big data experiments like Google Cars if you start to get a reputation as a place that just has giant fire hoses of data. Because people don't work on social media data because they're fascinated by liking and disliking, and they dreamed their whole lives about selling advertising. But these are people who are trained to work on big data. And the only place they can do it is Wall Street, Silicon Valley, and Seattle. So that's actually not that hard of a group to jump into. It really isn't. And it's going to get even stranger as people's capacity to generate stuff branches out into hardware. So this is from a company called Little Bits. The woman who founded it was at the Media Lab at MIT, and she came up with this idea that people ought to be able to program Legos into electronic components. So these are magnetized electronic components that you can use to build microphones, lights, any sort of hardware you can imagine, and the magnets snap up in ways that prevent you from electrocuting yourself. So I cannot assemble IKEA furniture. I am so spatially disabled. Right? I built a microphone in less than 30 seconds with no instructions using Little Bits. So again, as people start to build machines that themselves consume and create data, bandwidth-rich environments are going to be really, really important. And it's going to become much less important where you are physically, and much more important how quickly your machines can talk to the internet and how quickly they can get information back. Right? So I'm trying to call these capacity models, right? Because these are known unknowns, where these are going to happen and we don't have bandwidth capacity to deal with them. And I apologize in advance. As a semantics guy, my instinct is to try to classify things because it provides an effective way to deal with things. But take the taxonomies with a grain of salt, right? But I really think that the capacity that it creates is the other easiest place to forecast, right? So these are things that we know we don't know. Sorry, I should rephrase. That we don't know that we know. Right? We know we're going to need capacity. We're not really sure for what's going to come out of it. So imagine being able to provide BitTorrent as a service. So BitTorrent has been thought of as a pirate's tool, because what it does is take any given song and put a tiny piece of it on 50 different computers. And what that allows for is incredibly faster downloading and uploading than would be possible if I was just taking it from one computer. But if you could provide that as a legal service to Apple for iTunes streaming, suddenly Apple's system gets a lot more massively fault tolerant, and again, they're not reliant on a single data center somewhere, right? When one Amazon web cluster goes down, right, half the web grinds to a halt. Right? Tumblr stops working. It's incredible how many businesses are built on one single ecosystem, which is the Amazon cloud. But if you actually thought of BitTorrent as something you could provide as a legal service, again, with professional services that certified that it wasn't being used for piracy, you have a tremendously valuable regional advantage. Not just thinking about the gigabit between the houses here, but thinking about having guaranteed pipes in and out of Kansas City, so that you could sell as a guarantee to somebody the capacity to stream in, a set of incredibly high-resolution, high-definition feeds of a live event, and guarantee that you had a certain amount of load out of Kansas City. Then the gigabit fiber inside the city becomes how you do your load balancing. Right? Again, that's an infrastructure investment that most regionalities and municipalities aren't going to make because there's nothing to do with it once it gets here. And I think another service that you can look at would be data transfer intensive services. So again, when you're looking at big scale telemedicine, right, the machines are creating higher and higher resolution images, larger and larger data. You might have 5 full genotypes for one person, right? Skin, blood, and then 3 versions of the tumor if they have cancer, alongside all of the images around that person, alongside sort of dynamic lifestyle data coming off of the phone. If you have that for a cohort of 500,000 people, which would be really interesting, where are you going to store that? Because you need to be able to push that in a secure environment to a medical center on demand. Nobody knows how to do that right now. I mean, not a single company in the world can guarantee you, say, I can take your 17 exabyte data set and push that to KU Medical Center in a secure, HIPAA-compliant, standards-compliant environment. Right? It's a fantastic service, but if you don't have gigabit, you are going to be unplugging the hard drive and walking it over to KU Medical Center. And that's deeply unsatisfying. And then I think this mix of open data and open hardware is going to really explode, which is, if you think about that Google car and the little bit slide, I put them next to each other for a reason, which is that people are going to start making their own stuff that looks more and more like self-driving cars. Right? There have already been deployed, right, in the Middle East in the last 2 months, swarms of drones that provide mesh Wi-Fi for protesters, right, built on open hardware. These things aren't going away, and they're going to demand more and more of the data. They're going to demand more and more of the bandwidth. And if everyone is downloading Netflix movies, and everyone is watching things on Amazon Plus, and then suddenly machines start consuming bandwidth too, right, we're going to hit a crunch. And that's when bandwidth as a service becomes an incredibly powerful regional tool, right? But going from bandwidth as a service to BitTorrent as a service is important because it can let you conceptualize technically what you're going to do. Right? You would want a server in the basement of every house, right, with enough electricity to run a washing machine or a dryer and a guaranteed gigabit wired connection. Because then anyone that owned one of those houses would have to do is drop in a prefab server, and they're up on the BitTorrent network. It's easy. So yeah, capacity models. Now, none own knowns. Even Apple can't license the content they want, right? My wife loves HGTV. It's her brain candy. HGTV is not available on any purchasable medium. You can watch it on your phone or on an iPad through their app, but you can't buy their shows through iTunes. You can't buy their shows through Amazon, right? No one's been able to negotiate them to the table. If you want ESPN services, you have to be a subscriber of a cable company to get access to their internet services, because the cable companies are desperate to keep ESPN tied to cable. Desperate, right? I'm only able to watch events because my neighbor uses Comcast and he's given me his login. So I'm a pirate when it comes to that. Yes, I know, I'm being recorded. You can't control pricing. Right? As a municipality, you're not going to be able to control whether an ebook costs $5 or $10 or $15, or how much a movie costs online. Right? Only the companies in the market and the Department of Justice can control pricing. So don't worry about it. The user experience is probably not something that is going to get cracked here. The user experience is probably going to take 50 to 100 companies utterly failing to get big data experiences right. Let other regionalities fund 100 startups that buy 100 expensive espresso machines and fail. Seriously. I mean, I don't think it's going to happen in the next couple of years because there aren't that many people who actually understand big data. There's not that big of a user base. And there's not that many people who can actually spend money on data products right now because they haven't been sufficiently abstracted. So that's a place where I would sort of watch, let other people lose, and learn from very rapidly the failed companies that are out there, and maybe even contemplate having a group whose job it is to study companies that have been funded in big data spaces so that you can abstract out the experiences that are working and the ones that aren't. There's the classic story about Steve Jobs and Bill Gates arguing about the implementation of windowing systems. And Jobs brought Gates in to scream at him in front of all the Apple employees. To say, you stole the windowing system from us. And Bill Gates very calmly said, the way I look at it is, we both had this neighbor named Xerox, and I broke into his house to steal his TV and found out you had stolen it first. Right? That's good business strategy and technology. So you want to study what's being funded in Silicon Valley, study what's being funded in Boston. I don't know that I would invest in it here right now as much as I would in some of these other lower risk models like service and capacity, which right, you're going to have to do some stuff with. And you also can't control the fact that people really are getting more and more hateful of monopolies, especially cable monopolies. And almost all of these things we've been talking about tie somehow back to content and cable monopolies. And so sort of, again, punt on them. It's okay. You also can't control, right, any of the sort of civil aspects of data, which is that people really don't understand it. We've only had big data for maybe 10 years. Right? Most people don't understand probability or statistics, right? And most people give away their data as standard operating procedure to use their mobile phones or to use online services. And there are massive privacy fights that are coming around all of these issues. You can't control that. Right? What you can control are services around these things, right? And being the people who understand these problems better than anybody. And I think those are how you create jobs in this space in the short term. And you can't control the fact that the first wave of startups are already there. Right? There's been, if you have an O'Reilly conference about something, it's too late to be in the first wave of startups. Right? And that's, we've already had 2 years of Strata in Silicon Valley, so you can't really control the first wave. And again, all these things are actually completely fine. And you really don't know what's actually going to bring people here to start businesses. Not yet. And that's okay. Right? All of these things are actually really good things. They're not really bad things. So I would propose that for this area, actually, you can have a convention model. Again, not sexy from a high-tech perspective, right? But not all jobs will be high-tech jobs. Not all 2,500 companies will be high-tech companies. Right? I'm staying at the Intercontinental for a different conference. It's a very nice hotel to have a conference. There are 250 people at the conference, paying $200 a night for their rooms, flooding the plaza every night to go out and eat and drink on corporate accounts. It's a really good way to bring money into town. Right? And not all conventions are conferences. Right? This is a LAN house-based conference in Brazil. You can't have this in a town that has crappy Wi-Fi in the municipal area or crappy internet. So how many people, you've been to a conference where the Wi-Fi has been saturated? It's awful. Right? If you can promote to conference organizers that your guests can bring their iPad, their iPhone, and their laptop, all of them, and no one will get less than 100 megabit down, you have a serious competitive advantage to recruit people to your town. Right? If you have unlimited municipal Wi-Fi for people as they're roaming the plaza to use their augmented reality apps, knowing that it's going to be active and free and fast, right? Suddenly this becomes a really interesting place to do these sorts of events. You get hospitality jobs, and you can start to have the big data hackathons here. Again, that data transfer capacity suddenly makes it really interesting to bring together your 50 favorite nerds to work on giant data sets versus someplace else. Because you can have, 5 houses next to each other, the Kaufman houses, perhaps, and say, each team's going to be working on a giant data set, and we can pass those giant data sets from house to house, not in a matter of days or weeks, but in a matter of minutes. And those are actually really valuable from a cash perspective. And data-intensive training. Again, if you develop the service expertise in the first area, then where are the lawyers going to come to learn about how to do legal deals? Where are the technical services providers going to come to do legal deals? And whether you know it or not, what you're doing if you do this is investing in the unknown unknowns. Because you're investing in the talent and the capacity that lets really unexpected stuff happen in a place where it could only happen. Right? And that's the real point of all of this, is that you want to, if you really want to have 2,500 companies, it will probably come from the wildcat zone. It will probably not come from any of these other areas, because there's reasons regionally and socially that you might get outcompeted. But if you can build that capacity in all of these, that's where you get emergence. And that's sort of my argument here, is that what you want to do is design for the emergence of as many unknown unknowns as possible, because that's where you're going to get totally new fields that can only work in gigabit, and which is going to give you that 5 to 10 year competitive advantage. Right? So obviously we don't know what they are. I've been playing around with some ideas. One of them is bandwidth markets. Right? If bandwidth is a valuable commodity, it should be tradable. Right? We trade things. In Kansas City, there is actually a wheat exchange. But you could imagine actually selling stocks and bonds based on bandwidth futures. Right? Now, if you could securitize that, what you would say is that to people, because why would I buy the extra internet service? Well, you're not buying internet service. You're buying shares in the Kansas City bandwidth market. You can either use those yourselves, or you can actually even sell, turn them into bonds. And then you can raise money instead of raising startup funds by selling your bonds. It's a securitized debt. Right? These are the sorts of things that actually become possible when you have an entire area, right, that buys in. And then you can even have a municipal program that says, here's why you should buy shares in the bandwidth market. Then it's not, should I choose this or Comcast? Because you're going to lose that choice. Comcast is going to make sure you lose if the choice is to buy Comcast or buy Google Fiber. Right? They're going to deny you content if you're on Google Fiber unless you also buy Comcast. right? They're going to really go after you. So you have to have a different reason, right? And if you want to have 2,500 companies, right, having 10,000 people thinking of themselves as entrepreneurs is a good way to get there. And then every person who's got a house that's been wired has a share in the market. 5 people in a neighborhood can get together, pool their shares, sell bonds, and suddenly you've got $25,000 to start a company. And there didn't even need to be a venture capitalist, right? These are insane ideas, but that's sort of the point. Again, and obviously we don't want to do that. And so another way to think further is through what is called design fiction. And so this is actually a screenshot from 2001: A Space Odyssey. And it's not rendering really well, but this movie was made in 1969. Those are basically iPads. Samsung is using this photograph in their patent lawsuit against Apple to talk about novelty and non-obviousness. And so in many ways, the last 3 boxes of the square are things that we can really quite easily dream as reality. But we may need to think more from a designer perspective or even a fictional perspective to really think 5, 10, 15 years out. What does it look like? Or what does Kansas City look like when it's got 2,500 companies? When it is the epicenter of services around massively parallel bandwidth. And so design fiction is the name of the space that practices this. And so there's a guy named Bruce Sterling, who's a science fiction author, who's sort of the most famous exponent of this. And so I have a couple of my own examples, but I want to apologize to the people who are actually good at it. And so this is the sort of thing that they do. So imagine a future in which you walk into your local store and the National Diabetes Council says maximum 3 candy bars. And if you go, I'll send you a link. There's this whole video. It's a 5-minute video of what it's going to be like to go to the corner store in 10 years. And there are limits. There are diabetes limits on how many candy bars you can buy. There's health limits on how many sodas you can buy. Right? It's actually kind of a scary, regulated future in which your blood sugar is available as a piece of open data, and your rights to consume are actually curtailed in the name of the public good. But it's a set of fictional ways of thinking about things that actually make it much easier to see possible futures than a business plan to curb diabetes would have. And so practicing this a little bit, and maybe even inviting some of these practitioners to come and scare the hell out of you for a couple of days might be a good way to think. And so what I came up with was, I want to live on 1201 Server Farm Lane, so that every new house that's built has that jack for a server in the base. And when I move in, I know that my basement is flood secure, has its own air conditioning. Right? I get a break on my mortgage, but I have to buy shares in the bandwidth market. Right? Suddenly, I have a reason to live in Kansas City. I have a reason to start my business in Kansas City. And you could even begin to extrapolate out, right? You could say, why don't we have a patent pool that's only available to people who live in the bi-state area or tri-state area who've bought shares in the bandwidth market? Suddenly you're starting to get geographic lock-in in a way that's almost impossible to achieve in any other way. You say, we've got biotech imaging patents from KUMC. We've got an entire portfolio from the University of Kansas. Well, God, I'd love to run my business here, especially if you're filing patents as you go, right, on those service businesses that you build in the known space. Right? If you're building all that expertise, suddenly there's a reason to stay here. There's a reason to start your companies here. And you begin to lock it in. But it only happens if you start to think of these as clusters and server farms. Right? And then I sort of went back to Kansas City's famous FABYARDS. Right? So if you're going to begin to do 3D printing, right, these are 3D printed airplanes. These require massive computational investments in infrastructures. Right now, most of the people doing this are spending $4,000 or $5,000 a month for loft space in New York City or San Francisco. And no one has thought to invest in FABYARDS as an actual capacity. Right? And Kansas City has a long tradition of being in the middle of that. So if you start to think fictionally, right, instead of business plans, you can go some pretty interesting places. And so what I wanted to sort of end with is I think that for that space, it's actually design models. So thinking about business models, in my opinion, is too small of a taxonomy of what you want to look at. And you want to be pushing for, right, these are places you can probably create jobs very quickly in service and capacity. I think you can cultivate, within a fairly short period of time, convention models. Right? This is already a great place to do conventions. And once you have the fiber, all it takes is sort of a marginal investment in municipal Wi-Fi to really take advantage of that. And then what you've done is planted the bamboo, and what you do is you water it and you wait. Because bamboo, you water and you water and you water it, and after about 3 or 4 years, suddenly it explodes. And that's where you're going to get the unknowns. It comes from investing in this capacity, right, and sort of farming in capacity, service, and conventions, right, while you develop the capacity locally. And then suddenly you're going to look around and be shocked at what happens. And so that's what I'll sort of stop with, is that the success of this project would be being radically and completely surprised by the industrial sectors that emerge from gigabit, as opposed to saying we're going to be satisfied if what we do is incrementally make Netflix faster. I think that would be a failure of imagination, and it's also a failure of the geographical opportunity, because it's very likely in 20 years that everyone will have gigabit. And what you want to be is, in the same way that everyone has Silicon now, but Silicon Valley is still the region, is they took advantage of that window where it was geographically limited. And you're going to have that window here. I mean, yeah, there's Chattanooga, but Chattanooga doesn't have the entrepreneurial focus that Kansas City does, or the size that Kansas City does. And so how do you take advantage of that short window? And so my proposed taxonomy, I'll stop. We can take any questions you guys might have. Thank you. Got to be somebody. Even, okay.
If you were going to create a district in Kansas City and say this is a district where we really want to encourage entrepreneurs, experimenters to come, what would you put in that district in terms of amenities, services?
I mean, you definitely... I think that, you want to make sure that all those buildings are actually wired. You want to make sure they have really stable electricity. Nerds are really finicky about buildings where the power goes out. It doesn't matter how cool it looks. And then I think you need to at least encourage street-level retail. I think typically, companies are, in my experience, are really happy when they're on the second floor and there's a sandwich shop on the first floor. So you want at least some minimal retail. I think like Old Westport would be a perfect place to do some of that, right? More so than the Plaza area in Kansas City. But also because it's close to the hotels, but not in the hotel area. But I really think that the best thing you can do is invest in these predictable areas while really making sure you have space where weird things can happen. And so I think having spaces in those whatever neighborhood you choose that are dedicated for short-term use by people coming in from out of town would be really, really powerful. And these are, co-working spaces or hack spaces. They've been sort of over-branded. But the idea being, you're not coming here for a 2-day conference. You're coming here for 2 weeks to get ready for a conference, and then 2 weeks afterwards, and you've got a comfortable space to be, right, in a neighborhood you want to be in. I think that's where I would go. But I actually really think most of the jobs in the short term are going to be lawyers, right, network engineers, hospitality jobs, and trying to recruit out some of the people who are doing streaming and get them to relocate some of their existing employees here. I'm not sure that there's a magic wand you can wave and get startups to happen. But I am pretty sure if you could get ESPN to relocate their streaming unit here, and Google to relocate some of their TV people here, and Apple to relocate TV people here, that startups would come from that. Because that's where it's people who are dissatisfied with big companies who start really successful companies, in my experience. And so one of the first steps would be to recruit the big companies to put their bandwidth-intensive service units here. Then you can woo them. Then you can say, boy, if you started a company, we get this great neighborhood with screaming fast bandwidth and good beer, and then it becomes attractive because they're like, man, I'm sick of working in this giant soulless place out by the airport where I can't open the windows. But they have to be here first, I think.
versus business plan competition?
I think, so I'm not beating up on business plan competitions in general. I think that they're actually really powerful ways to find people, right? I think the best thing about business plan competitions is you find people who are willing to start things, right? It's really powerful for that. But yeah, I think that challenging people to design, what's the Craigslist ad look like for a job posting in Kansas City in 5 years or 10 years might get you more creative ideas because you're not focused on, is this, because most of the people in business plan competitions, I was one of them when I started my company 13 years ago. I mean, I read the book on how to write a business plan. And it was all this sort of, show a rational path to profitability. And that constrains your thinking when you're talking about a world that doesn't exist yet, which is a fiber world. So I would say do both. I wouldn't stop doing startup weekends. I wouldn't stop doing business plan competitions. That's how you build your roster. But I would at the same time try to challenge those people and say, okay, well, what if you're working backwards from Scott Case's challenge where now you live in Kansas City, it's 2022, and there's 2,500 bandwidth-intensive companies. Right? What does the LinkedIn openings profile set look like in Kansas City for that? And if you can start to mesh the people who are willing to take big risks and dream and write business plans with really big ideas, then you've really got something. And that's something that the Kauffman Foundation is ideally suited to recruit outside design people to lead some of those workshops. And you put your favorite Startup America, men and women and business plan competition winners, you put them into those workshops so that they start to get some contact with those crazy ideas. And that's I think the magic mix. Is I was in the MIT business plan competition in '99. I was at MIT for 6 years after that. Very few of those business plans led to real companies, but a lot of the people who submitted them did. Right? And so I wouldn't stop doing that because that's how you build your bench. But you want to get them thinking crazier and crazier thoughts.
So if you get the bigger companies to move units here, and those companies, through their attrition and dissatisfaction, spawn smaller companies that feed with them, might be synergistic with those companies. We hear a lot about funding. You've got to have funding. Could you speak to funding as a prioritization on the essential elements for starting creative companies?
Well, one of the attractions to doing it here is that at least theoretically, you're reducing the cost of failure if you're doing a bandwidth-intensive company. So one of the attractions to being here would be that it would cost you less and be less risky to leave. And I think funding is important. I think it's not as important necessarily as everyone likes to say it is, because the reality is if you have a good idea, there's a lot of money in Kansas City. And you don't need that much money to start and do something disruptive now, and at least get a proof of concept. But it would be interesting to have municipal tax credits. It would say, if you decide to leave your job for 6 months, we will reimburse your health care costs for you and your family. Right? That's the biggest thing the hardest thing for me when I started my first company and when I left my last job was health care. I didn't want government health care, but it would have been really nice to know that there was someone paying for my COBRA. And I think that's the sort of thing that I would almost put that as almost an equal level as funding, is saying, for 6 months, and because if you can't do it in 6 months, you should probably get a job, right? If you can't, whatever the right number is, you can sort of sign it, right?
You wouldn't need the full 18 months of COBRA.
I don't think so. I mean, because at that point, you're either on the wrong idea or your idea is not going to work, right? And you've had a run at it. And at that point, your family is probably going to look at you and say, okay, John, right, it's time to go back to the TV unit at Apple and beg for your job back. Because that's what happens when companies fail, right? Those ideas get reabsorbed back into the companies, and ideally they turn into new product lines. So I think you want to have funding, so you want to have an organized angel network. You want to have outposts of venture capitalists. You want to have native venture capitalists. But I think, again, regionally specific benefits that you can't get elsewhere would be fantastic. Because, I can go, and I did my company in RTP, and I got local VC money there. It wasn't, as sort of famous as getting VC money in Boston or Silicon Valley, and I never raised money from those places. But I raised $7 million over 3 years. Right? Money wasn't the problem. But if you had actual lifestyle benefits to being an entrepreneur in Kansas City, then I think you might have that creates a real advantage. That I think from a cost basis, you're talking about what, $2,000 a month, You know, so that's not that bad. $12,000 per entrepreneur and then you obviously need to have some sort of bar you have to cross to get that, right? Because otherwise I'm just going to quit and like, oh yes, I'm starting a company. And it's welfare if you don't do it right. But I think those are some things that you could think of creatively to pair with angel money that lower the risk profile to the person who's comfortable at Apple TV but kind of has this crazy idea. And say, well, why would you take that out of Apple instead of trying to move the needle, 0.5% at a giant public company, right? And then and if you lower the arguments against leaving, then I think you have a real argument. Yeah, exactly.
Time for one more?
So I just want to put a plug in for competitions. I just had a conversation with Ed Roberts this morning, who collects all the data around MIT entrepreneurs, and he told me, this is relative to the last 5 years, that 3/4 of all students that participate in a MIT, any kind of competition, and they have like 20, that get into the either semifinalist or finalist round become entrepreneurs. 3/4. I mean, that's a big number relative to experiential stuff, and especially as John talks about, the known unknowns, unknown unknowns. I mean, it's our young people who can see this stuff better than we can. So I think the more that we push these ideas of let's get more ideas and let's get people to work on them, the better off we are.
Well, and it's addictive. I mean, once I ran my own thing, I was going to be very hard to ever be a good employee again. And that's part of the reality is that people keep starting things because the second time is so much easier because right? You know which mistakes to not make. And you're sort of addicted to the idea that you can create radical asymmetric change by starting something. And so that's a huge part of it is just, the comfort to do it. I wouldn't have done it. My girlfriend at the time decided to go to graduate school, and we moved to North Carolina, and there were no jobs for me there, right? And so the only thing I had was this wacky idea based on my senior philosophy thesis at Tulane on a different way to process data. And so I entered I didn't enter the MIT competition expecting to win. I entered it so I had access to MIT programmers. And I recruited a CTO. I recruited a pro bono lawyer who was a third-year Harvard Law student. And then we all moved to North Carolina and ran the company there together because I didn't want to go work as a sales guy at IBM. And so but I didn't have a safety net. It was terrifying, right? I had a girlfriend in graduate school and no health care. And obviously she had no money because she was going to graduate school. And we had bought a house. So I was very motivated. I don't know where we're getting feedback from. Okay. Tornado sirens. You guys are this is like an earthquake in California. You guys are so mellow about it. But once you do it, my experience is once you get exposed to that sort of competitive way of behavior, going and working as a cog is really boring. And having a safety net, it would be, I would have loved to have had that in October when I left my old job, right? I had to sort of scramble to find my health care. And that would have made it so easy. It would have been a no-brainer inside the family, but I have a 6-month-old kid. My wife didn't have health insurance, and so she was like, okay, well, you can't quit your job until you find health insurance. So, I was doing stuff at night and on weekends for my new project, but I couldn't actually make the jump, which meant I couldn't start hiring people. So, I think it would work.
Join me in thanking John, everybody.